The Last Word, which is hosted tonight by Joy Reid, who is in for Lawrence. Good evening, Joy.
Good evening, Rachel. Yes, we are going to take that press conference live when it happens.
Good.
This is one of those stories that is extra disturbing to tell and very personal. I'm hearing from a lot of journalists tonight. I'm sure that you are, too, and a lot of Americans, period.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Absolutely.
we have to keep reporting on these.
None of these is not gut-wrenching, but this one, in this business, in some ways, we're all colleagues, you know, and it's just incredibly disheartening and upsetting. But we're about to get new information from authorities there, so we'll see that live in just a sec.
Absolutely. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
my friend.
Joy.
Have a good evening. And I am Joy Reid in for Lawrence O'Donnell. And tonight, we begin, before we get to that press conference, with the fight to replace Justice Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court. It's a fight that could reshape American policy and culture in Donald Trump's image for a generation or more. Now, as you'd expect, the battle lines are already being drawn. Senate Democrats are vowing to stop Trump from nominating a hard right justice to replace the often unpredictable Anthony Kennedy.
Remember what Senator McConnell told us when there was a vacancy under President Obama? Too close to an election. Let's let the people decide. Well, we're 4 months away from an election. Is Senator McConnell prepared to keep this office vacant until after the election? I hope so.
We realize the fact that Obama's final year was taken away from him to make an appointment. So that was a new standard. It was a low standard, if you will, but it was a standard. And I, for one, and I think others, haven't forgotten that. And, you know, as you sow, so you reap.
Okay, but here's the problem. Democrats do not have the votes to stop a Trump replacement from being confirmed. Thanks to Mitch McConnell invoking the so-called nuclear option, Republicans conceded justice with just 51 votes. And the parliamentary procedures available to Democrats are limited, and they depend on all of them holding together. Meanwhile, Republicans are also gearing up for a fight on what is the most fundamental issue for much of their base, control of the court. And they're dismissing the comparisons to their conduct in 2016 with President Obama's then nominee, Merrick Garland.
This is not 2016. There aren't the final months of a second-term constitutionally lame duck presidency with a presidential election fast approaching. We're right in the middle of this president's very first term.
Today, former Vice President Joe Biden, the longtime leader of the Senate Judiciary Committee, said that in normal times, with such a divided Senate, the president would look for a consensus candidate who could get votes from both parties. But we are not in normal times. So Biden also told voters, it's up to us, America. Speak out, rise up, be heard. And that seems to be what Democrats are planning. Politico reports that Senate Democrats want the Supreme Court battle waged on the policy stakes. So what does that battle look like? Well, according to the Daily Beast, Democrats appear, quote, poised to mount an aggressive public relations campaign, talking up the electoral consequences for Republicans should they confirm an ultra-right conservative justice. People should understand that this nominee will be there for decades to come, for our lifetimes, and a good part of our children's lifetime, Senator Richard Blumenthal said, and the consequences for our nation couldn't be higher. Our friend Ron Klain, who helped oversee the confirmation of Supreme Court justices under both Presidents Clinton and Obama, told the Daily Beast that Democratic lawmakers should, quote, frame the debate squarely and firmly around the future of abortion rights, to push hard on Senators Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, both pro-choice Republicans, and to work with Senators Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, critics of the president, on keeping Trump in check. Well, in a sign that the White House recognizes the importance of those senators, NBC News is reporting tonight that White House counsel Don McGahn reached out to Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski today to discuss the Supreme Court vacancy. The two senators confirmed the calls to NBC News. And just a short time ago, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders tweeted that Senators Collins and Murkowski, along with Republican Senator Chuck Grassley and 3 Democratic senators, met with Donald Trump tonight to discuss the future of the Supreme Court. She also says, quote, POTUS team also talked with more than a dozen other senators today as part of an ongoing outreach to get views and advice from both sides of the aisle. So we're still very early in the nomination process, and the strategies of the two sides are still being worked out. But one thing is certain, the people who may ultimately have the most power to influence who becomes the next nominee to the Supreme Court are the American people. As Joe Biden said today, the price to be paid for putting our values at risk must be clear now. Joining us now, Christopher Kang, former deputy counsel to President Obama, where he helped oversee the confirmations of Justice Kagan and Sotomayor. He's now the chief counsel of Demand Justice, which co-hosted a rally this morning at the Supreme Court. And also joining us, Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor, and Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor and national spokesperson for MoveOn.org. Thank you all for being here. Christopher, I'm going to start with you because you did organize that rally today. I feel like Democrats are staking much of their early messaging on looking for consistency out of Mitch McConnell and of trying to hold him to things he said in the past. That's obviously not the way Mitch McConnell operates. So absent some sudden, repair to precedent, and a completely uncharacteristic one, what else could Democrats do?
Right. So I think it's all well and good to talk about the process and to talk about the hypocrisy of Senate Republicans now. But we all know that Senate Republicans don't care about consistency or rules. So what we have to do is we have to fight this fight on the substance. We have to talk about the stakes. We have to talk about the access to abortion. We have to talk about, really, this is about the criminalization of abortion. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, they're talking about arresting women and their doctors for their health care choices. And this is not very far-fetched. This is the administration that's putting children in cages. They're not going to stop from putting women in jail.
Yeah, and Karine, Donald Trump, when he was interviewing with our own Chris Matthews, said there should be consequences for women who have abortions, that there should be legal consequences. Right. And this is the issue for the right. Let's just make it clear. This is what they vote on. Yeah. Well, here's Susan Collins, who a lot of Democrats are putting their hope in, her being consistent on this issue. Here she is talking about Roe.
One of the questions that I always ask is, do they respect precedent? What is their view toward precedent? From my perspective, Roe v. Wade is an important precedent, and it is settled law.
Okay, and here she is talking about her meeting with Don McGahn. I told him there are several well-qualified people on the list whom I've supported. There's one person on the list who I voted against, and I urged him to broaden the search beyond the list, which is not to say there are not some very good people on the list. But I think when you're looking at the Supreme Court nomination, you shouldn't confine yourself. Those are a lot of words. I'm not sure they mean a whole lot. Are Democrats foolish to put their hopes in Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins?
I have to say, Joy, I don't think they are foolish. And can I just say this? Mitch McConnell just plays in the gutter. Like, you cannot trust Mitch McConnell. The rules for Mitch McConnell work only when he says so. So that's just is not going to work right there. But I go back to a year ago, and we talked about this earlier, Joy, earlier today, which was what was happening a year ago. The ACA, the skinny repeal, just under a year ago, it was like last July, and people didn't think we were going to stop that. Right. They thought, oh, for sure, Obamacare was going to be repealed. It wasn't going to hold. Who were the three people that voted no? Look, McCain was the dramatic one, so we remember that one, but it was also Collins and Murkowski. Yeah. And so that no one thought that was going to happen. And what happened there was people spoke up. They flooded the lines. They went to town halls. They went to the Capitol, to the offices of the members, and they did not stop. It was amazing to see the energy behind that. We just have to double down and do the same. Just like Biden said, speak up, rise up, be heard. Yeah. And that's the only way this is going to convince Collins and Murkowski, hey, you know what? Don't be on the wrong side of history here. Yeah.
And Jason, there are two ways to go, right? So to Karine's point, if Democrats could somehow pull off getting these two senators to go along with not giving the 51 votes, the other way, there have been people who have been throwing around the parliamentary idea of just bringing the Senate to a halt, which you need all the Democrats to go along with. Let me introduce you to one, Heidi Heitkamp. She's not necessarily been consistent. She voted for Gorsuch. She's one of the three who did. She talked about her meeting with Trump. I stressed the importance of nominating someone for the Supreme Court as pragmatic, fair, compassionate, committed to justice, and above politics. I told the president he has a chance to unite the country by nominating a true ideological jurist who could gain support from senators on both sides of the aisle rather than create more divisions. Who thinks Donald Trump is going to do any of those things?
I don't believe any of these people. I don't trust any of the Democrats. I don't trust any of the Republicans. I certainly don't trust Mitch McConnell. We've all talked. He's a cancer on American democracy. In 100 years, they'll write about him being the new Benedict Arnold. This is what has to happen. And it's what you've talked about, it's Chris talked about, it's what Karine talked about. People are going to have to scream and complain. They're going to have to do what we did about the border. They're going to have to do what we did about the ACA. That is the only way that the most ideological maniac who's 15 minutes out of law school, because Trump's going to pick somebody like 36 years old. Yeah. He's going to pick the youngest person he can, so that person will be there for my great-grandchildren to see. They're going to have to find some way to make that embarrassing. But here's the issue. This is a marathon, not a sprint. They got 5, 6, 7 people from the Heritage Foundation they're going to want to push through. So it's not just about stopping the first person. It's about stopping as many people as possible until November 9th when people vote, and then possibly can take over the Senate if the passion about these judicial nominations can turn into voting behavior.
And I guess that's my challenge, Christopher, is that Democrats and Democratic leaners typically do not get passionate about the Supreme Court. It is the right that really fundamentally believes that they are heroically attempting to stop abortion. In their mind, this is their fundamental sort of reason for being, right, is to stop abortion from being legal. Whereas on the Democratic side, it's hard to get people exercised about the issue of the Supreme Court. It's sort of vague. And also, Democratic voters tend not to come out in midterms. Is there a way to get, I think the press conference is going to start. Hold that thought. I think we're going to go to this press conference now about the shooting in Maryland. Take a listen.
Release that information to you. We'll put it out as quickly as possible. So we wanted to have this press conference again just to give you guys an update on some information that we can put out about the victims, so that way we can start that healing process. So with that, I'll introduce our acting chief, Cranf, and then after Chief Cranf, we'll have Jen Corbin again from our mobile crisis that will talk about that healing process with these victims and with the families. Chief.
Thank you. As I stated earlier today, we are in the second phase, and this is our investigative process. Through that investigative process, we're going to bring some information to you that we can confirm. Before I give you the information on the victims, I want to say something about social media. The Anne Arundel County Police Department is very, very aware of what information you have on social media. But we have an obligation and a responsibility to these victims that we get it right, and we only get to do that once. So I can't confirm what's on your social medias. I can only tell you what our investigation has confirmed, and I'm going to share the names of our 5 victims with you now. First victim's name is Wendy Winters. Second victim is Rebecca Smith. Third victim is Robert Hyacin. Fourth victim is Gerald Fishman. And the 5th victim is John McNamara. So what I'd like to say about this is that at this point, our investigative portion of this kind of breaks off into two different areas. One is the person of interest that we do have in custody. That person of interest is being interviewed as we speak by our Criminal Investigation Division. We do not believe, and we know through the investigation, that there are no further threats to the Capital Gazette newspaper or to the area around 888 Bestgate Road. What I also would like to tell you is that the Anne Arundel County Police Department, with our partners throughout Anne Arundel County government, Annapolis City, the state, we work very well together. We have the best interest and well-being of our victims in mind. We have a warm line for Anne Arundel County. That number is 410-768-5522. And I would urge any persons who witnessed anything that occurred this evening, were walking by the address of 888, was near the address, who just need someone to speak to, I would urge them to call that line. Jen Corbin will have additional staff ready for this evening for any influx of phone calls, and I'm going to allow her to explain the warm line and the issues behind that in a second. I want to end on this. We have a responsibility and an obligation to these victims. Everyone in the Anne Arundel County Police Department and all of our allied agencies, all of our government officials, we are deeply saddened by what happened today. We're deeply saddened that we had to make those notifications, and we're deeply saddened that a person had to take this into his own hands, and this is a result. So I'm going to bring Jen Corbin up, and we're going to talk about the warm line real quick.
Can you please tell the names again?
I'll make sure everybody knows.
So good evening. Just to kind of explain what's happened, my staff has been here since this occurred. We have been involved in the reunification of the witnesses to their families, along with notifying the families of the people who've lost their lives. For the warm line, basically what we're asking is anyone who spoke with us today or anybody who maybe did not make contact with us through investigations, that they can reach out through that number. We have licensed clinicians on 24 hours a day. We will come out and help you in any way possible. What I'm going to ask is that we're not using that number to call for information on the investigation. That is not what this number is for. This number is for people who have witnessed and might need assistance getting through the trauma piece of this. We are not asking you to call and ask questions about which family members are where, or us to give comments on the investigation. We are here to help. So that number is for family and witnesses to call in. We will be available all night long. We can come out if people need it, or discuss how people are doing by phone. Thank you.
Okay, so again, that's the information that we have to hold true to what we said in the beginning of this. As soon as we have information, we'll get it out. So that was the purpose of calling this press conference. Again, that warm line number is 410-768-5522. So that's the number to call for anyone that needs assistance and needs to talk to somebody for support. Thank you. Yeah. So, yep. So the first is Wendy Winters.
All right. Joining us now is NBC News correspondent Hans Nichols. All right, Hans, we now have the names of these victims: Wendy Winters, Rebecca Smith, Robert Hyacinth, Gerald Fishman, and John McNamara. Those families have been notified. Tell us what else we now know, if anything, about this gunman.
Well, we just learned from law enforcement here that the suspect is being interrogated. Now, that doesn't mean he's cooperating, but they say he is still being interrogated. And they've also determined that this entire region here, you can see cars going back up and back and forth here, is now no longer under threat. We've learned quite a bit of what went down this afternoon. The suspect, the alleged suspect, Jared Ramos, came in. He's a late 30s male, came in with a shotgun and smoke grenades, and he had a vendetta against this newspaper, the Capital Gazette. He had clear issues with them. He had filed a suit against them about defamation. He had lost that suit, and he went in there intent on targeting and killing certain individuals. We now know the names of those 5, and I think the urgent task for law enforcement tonight is try to figure out if there are any missed signals. What was this individual's social media profile? How intent was he? How direct and explicit were his threats? Because once the threat became manifest and the shooting started, law enforcement here reacted remarkably swiftly within 60 to 90 seconds. It's really a reminder and an indication of how much experience and how much training law enforcement all across this country now has for active shooters. They were able to stop him. He did not put up a fight, but not before he took the lives of 5 journalists who were just doing their jobs. Joy?
Thank you so much, Hans Nichols. Much appreciated. And joining us now is Jim Kavanaugh, MSNBC law enforcement analyst and retired ATF special agent in charge. All right, Jim, what do you glean from what we know so far? This is somebody who had a vendetta specifically against this newspaper, having filed a lawsuit against them, did not allowed himself to be taken alive, however.
Right, Joy. Well, and this thing went on for years, simmering with this guy. You know, it's a revenge motive. He wanted to get back at the Gazette. Because they wrote a story about when he pled guilty to a harassment charge in 2011. So you can imagine every reporter in America and the world writes these stories as a matter of routine. So it's just a routine story, but he went after them for defamation, and he lost his appeal with the circuit court just last week. And then he went on his rampage. So he's a man choking on an empty grudge. It's a revenge motive. They're saying he's not cooperating so far, but the Baltimore Sun has reported that he had a Twitter feed out with some, you know, talking about corrupt corpses of the Gazette in recent days and some, you know, hateful language. So he's talking on his Twitter feed a little. And Anne Arundel County Patrol, what a great job they did. They caught him at the scene. They got him. They got witnesses. You know, they got his postings on Twitter, which may be enough. It may be better than a confession in the long run if they tie it right to him. They got a strong case, but that's not going to bring back these 5 great people, these journalists and newspaper employees that we lost today. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of people sort of were drawing an inward breath when the idea that, these people, some of whom were even tweeting out that their own fears. What can you walk us through what an investigation like this would then be like? You do have the suspect, whether or not he's cooperating. How extensively are law enforcement able to get control of this person's social media? How much are they entitled to? What's that process of investigating a case like this?
Yeah, the commanders have set a lot of that in motion. They're already doing a search warrant at the suspect's house in Laurel, Maryland. They've got the detectives on scene, special agents. They're going to be executing that warrant and looking for, be taking, I'm sure, his laptop and any electronic devices. He didn't have identification on him. And the police said his fingerprints might have been disfigured on purpose to disguise his identity. That could be. I've had a lot of guys worked as masons in concrete work, and their fingers were always disfigured from the acid from their employment. So sometimes it's occupational, but it can be deliberate. And he didn't have an ID with him, and maybe he's trying to, not cooperate with the detectives. But like I said, he put out enough stuff on Twitter. This feud's long-standing. The evidence is clear. The old proverb, Joy, when you set out on a journey for revenge, first dig 2 graves. This guy may be breathing, but his life, for all intents and purposes, will be over. The evidence is strong, and he'll never get out of a prison. So it's a sad, sad case, but he was known. There was leakage on the guy. All of supervisors and managers and leaders of whatever your facility is, think about even taking some minor steps for security. Lock doors, use buzzers, have some video surveillance. Definitely let the police know about people that are in disputes with you. Do little things if you can't do big things, but never do nothing. Always do something to try to interrupt these things.
And, we're seeing some of the employees of the Gazette walking out, that sort of now familiar, unfortunate march that we see people with their hands up after one of these situations, whether it's in a school or a theater. We're now seeing it in a workplace. We're seeing it so much. And, I think what a lot of people are wondering is there any way to tell whether somebody goes from being disgruntled or being angry or, being angry at either their classmates or their workmates to being this, because it does seem to happen with disturbing frequency, unfortunately, in America.
Well, that's a good question, Joy, and mental health professionals can tell. And when you get someone like this who will not let something go for years and years, that a normal person would say, what are you talking about? You're angry because the newspaper wrote a story when you pled guilty in court to harassment. So it's someone choking on an empty grudge sometimes, and they just won't let it go. It's just beyond normal. That's a sign usually that something's really wrong. Now, people can get mad at a lot of things in business, in courts, with newspapers, with law enforcement. But, when it seems real unusual, this guy, we know he's had a harassment arrest, and it's possible that he has a lot of minor arrests for fights and disturbances. It will be interesting to see. Interactions with people, never getting along, thrown out of restaurants, that kind of thing. Those kind of people just sort of percolate along in society, going from one conflict to the next. They're like a swirling vortex of trouble. They're the people you see in road rage incidents and fights all the time, and into their adulthood. I'm not talking about a juvenile now, I'm talking about into their adulthood. So be interesting to see what his criminal history is like, and we may learn more about that tomorrow.
Jim Kavanaugh, thank you very much. Really appreciate you. And thanks very much to our guests, Karine Jean-Pierre, Chris Kang, Jason Johnson. Thank you all. And coming up, around the country, people gathered in the streets to protest the Trump administration's policy of separating children from their asylum-seeking parents, as the First Lady went to the border and held another media availability. And new reports that Donald Trump wants to weaken NATO and the European Union. Coincidentally, two things that Vladimir Putin also wants. Protesters around the country vented their anger at Donald Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy today, and more protests are planned for this weekend. Today, hundreds of women showed up in Washington to call for an end to the cruel policy of family separations. According to Capitol Police, 575 people were arrested at that protest. There were also protests at the federal courthouse in Brownsville, Texas, in Milwaukee, where Donald Trump was visiting, and in Arizona, where First Lady Melania Trump made her second trip to the border in a week, after her first border visit was overshadowed by her fashion choice, a jacket that said, "I really don't care. Do you?" Today, the First Lady made 2 stops in Arizona. She visited a facility in Phoenix that is housing 121 children, including 81 separated from their parents, and she visited a Border Patrol facility in Tucson.
I know how dangerous and difficult your daily jobs are, so I really appreciate all you do for, behalf of the country. And I'm looking forward for our discussion and to tour the facility. And I'm here to support you and give my help, whatever I can, for behalf of children and the families.
Joining us now from Tucson, Arizona is MSNBC correspondent. Oh, okay, so we do not have Mariana Atencio yet. We're going to bring her in as soon as we can. Do we have Emily Jane Fox? Should we bring her in? Okay, let's bring in Emily Jane Fox, senior reporter at Vanity Fair and MSNBC contributor. Okay, I'm going to have you hold on for me. Emily Jane Fox, I'm going to come to you in a second. I'm going to go back to Mariana Atencio. We do have her shot now. So, Mariana, if you could just tell us what, if any, impact the First Lady's visit had, you think, on those migrant families today?
So, Joy, the focus of her visit, especially here in Tucson, as we just heard in the soundbite prior to our conversation, was really the Border Patrol agents. When she visited that facility, there were 10 children there, but she really focused her remarks toward the agents, toward the difficulty in doing their job. And truth be told, I was embedded with the Border Patrol last week, and they are under incredible amounts of pressure. I mean, they told me, listen, we're human beings too. We are dads and we are parents too. And her visit today was sort of a recognition to their work. But honestly, on the ground, Joy, here for the organizations that are working to reunify these kids with their parents, but also for people that are working in shelters like the one where I'm standing now. This is a shelter that has 23 people, babies as young as 8 months old that crossed the border as recently as yesterday. And even though they weren't separated, they are asylum seekers that are having made wait up to 2 weeks to make it to the United States. So for the people on the ground here helping the migrant families and especially helping the children, her visit, they tell me, was nothing more than a photo op. Joy?
And Mariana, could you just walk us through what is happening now on the border in terms of the process for these families? What are they being told to do?
I was astounded, Joy, by what I uncovered here in the Nogales border in Arizona. Family after family telling me they are trying to seek asylum at ports of entry, and they are being made to wait up to 2 weeks. The wait is so long that there's an organization in Mexico called Kino that is sheltering these people and giving them numbers, like in a supermarket line, for them to wait out to then go to the bridges. Then they spent around 2 or 3 days on average at the bridge. It's over 100 degrees here, and they're doing that with little babies. I mean, it's inhumane. It's a health hazard, if you will. And then they try to come here and seek asylum. So it's a story we're going to look into, no doubt, and it is making it nearly impossible for these families to seek asylum the right way, as the administration claims they should. Joy?
Mariana Atencio, thank you very much for your reporting. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And today, Ivanka Trump was at the State Department, where she helped unveil the government's annual report on human trafficking, which calls on foreign governments to put a halt to the practice that endangers mostly women and children. This year's report contains 2 pages condemning the separation of children from their families. At one point, it reads, quote, "Removal of a child from the family should only be considered as a temporary last resort." Ivanka Trump did not speak at the event, and she has not made any comments at her public appearances about the Trump administration's policy of separating more than 2,000 children from their parents. Instead, she reportedly only spoke out in private, asking her father, quote, "Daddy, what are we doing about this?" And tweeting last week, now that an EO has been signed ending family separation at the border, it's time to focus on swiftly and safely reuniting the families that have been separated. Today, Vanity Fair's Emily Jane Fox reports this about Ivanka Trump's silence on the border crisis. People who know the first daughter, who are by now familiar with her cycle of silence and closed-door entreaties to her father, were baffled as to how she botched her messaging in such a major way. One person summed it up this way, quote, "It's now clearly at the point where she is overly gaming every move out, and that leads to paralysis. What we saw last week was just total paralysis. She does know what's right, but she's scared to even do that." Joining me now is Emily Jane Fox, senior reporter at Vanity Fair and MSNBC contributor. She's the author of the new book, Born Trump. Thank you very much for your patience with a few technical difficulties there, Emily. I want you to talk just a little bit about this contrast. So you have the First Lady being sent out to the border to sort of make a show of compassion this time. She didn't have the jacket, but really focusing her compassion on the Border Patrol officials. And then you have Ivanka, who's not even doing that, who's sort of not doing anything. What do you make of it?
You know, it's interesting. The First Lady spoke out initially last weekend, a week and a half ago now, and gave a statement that basically said nothing, but at least she had something to say. And then she tried to go down last week to the border, and of course the jacket overshadowed her trip. And her trip today was largely a photo op, but again, it showed that she has some interest in this. And what do we see the person who is in the White House, who is there to be an advisor for women and children and families, doing? Absolutely nothing. You don't hear her saying anything publicly. You don't see her doing anything. I do believe that she has said something to her father privately about the issue on the border. I know from my reporting that that is true, but that is not enough when your entire role in the West Wing is to be a public advocate for women and children. And people around her, people who have advised her recently, people who are friends of hers from years ago, people who talk to her all the time, have said this was an easy layup for her. The First Lady had already paved the way for her. All she had to do was just mimic what the First Lady had said. She wouldn't risk her father getting mad at her, which is something she's deeply concerned about. And she still couldn't even do that. And they are just baffled by her silence. And as one former friend told me yesterday, this is something that's going to stick to her.
But, you know, Emily, you just said something that I have to go back to you and sort of recap, that she doesn't want to risk her father getting mad at her. Part of being an advisor, particularly at this level, a White House advisor, is that you're the person who can tell the president things that will make him mad because you are trying to improve his policies. On something like this that is so dramatic, the whole world is watching this administration take children from their parents. Why is she in the White House if she's afraid of making Donald Trump mad at her?
Well, that's a great question. This is why it is unusual, and it had been illegal for half a century for someone in a person's family to serve in a West Wing position. There's a reason why you don't appoint your family members, because there is that level of conflict of interest and an inability to actually serve as a traditional advisor. But I will say, it's not that she's afraid of speaking up in private. It's that he gets angry if she speaks up in public about something. We saw this when she spoke up about Roy Moore in the campaign, and she said there's a special place in hell for people who treat children improperly. And her father, behind the scene, was frustrated that she made that public statement. So it's not that there's an issue with her advising him behind the scenes. It's when it comes to speaking out publicly, there is a bit of a hesitation of, is this going to upset the relationship? And that is exactly why having a first daughter in a senior role in the West Wing is an issue, and why it has been illegal for half a century.
Well, what is the relationship? I mean, is it that she is a dependent? Is it a business relationship? What is the relationship?
It's all of the above. It's a very complicated relationship. This is someone who has essentially been his employee since she was born, but they are very close at the same time, and he does value her opinion. But at the end of the day, the only person who can tell Donald Trump what to do is Donald Trump.
Yeah. Politico is reporting that Maggie Cordish, who's a close friend of Ivanka Trump and an advisor to her on the issue she was supposed to be conversant on, paid family leave, has left the White House. There are no plans to replace her, signaling a likely pullback from the White House's efforts to pass paid family leave. Was this always a fig leaf, all of this stuff about doing things for families and women and girls? Was that always a ruse? Because what Donald Trump is doing now in terms of the way he treats families and children, this is actually what he wants to do.
You know, it's difficult to say what her exact intentions were. There are a number of times where she will go make public speeches, where she will go and launch different initiatives having to do with science and technology education. But those are the easy wins. Those are the things that her father doesn't much care about or aren't particularly sticky within the rest of the West Wing. Those are the things that traditionally maybe a first lady or a first daughter would support. There's no controversy there. When it comes to the controversial issues, when it comes to her having to speak up against an administrative position, she is silent time and time again. I think it's time that we all stop expecting her to do the right thing, because she never has since she has joined the administration.
Yeah, well, amen to that. Emily Jane Fox, thank you very much. Appreciate your reporting. Thank you. And coming up, new reports tonight that Donald Trump has suggested doing something that Vladimir Putin would love: breaking up the European Union. Well, it's official. Donald Trump is finally getting one of the things that he seemed to want the most. Trump is scheduled to hold a summit meeting with Vladimir Putin on July 16th in Helsinki, a city with a long history of hosting U.S.-Russia summits. The White House statement was vague on the details of what Trump and Putin are expected to discuss. Here's part of the two-line statement from the White House. Quote, the two leaders will discuss relations between the United States and Russia and a range of national security issues. Yesterday, National Security Advisor John Bolton, who met with Putin yesterday in Moscow, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo assured lawmakers and reporters that Trump will discuss Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election when he meets with Putin. However, it becomes harder to be optimistic about that after Trump's tweet this morning saying Russia continues to say they had nothing to do with meddling in our election. Where's the DNC server, and why didn't shady James Comey and the now disgraced FBI agents take and examine it? Why isn't Hillary Russia being looked at? So many questions, so much corruption, exclamation point. Trump's meeting with Putin is set to follow the NATO summit in Belgium. Today, we learned about comments that Trump made about NATO in a private meeting during the G7 summit earlier this month that have some U.S. allies concerned. Axios reports that Trump told leaders it will be an interesting summit. NATO is as bad as NAFTA. It's much too costly for the U.S. The report also says that Trump made the comment after telling the G7 leaders that Crimea probably should belong to Russia because everyone there speaks Russian. And tonight we've learned that Trump reportedly made a pitch to the president of France to leave the EU. According to the Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin, during a private meeting at the White House in late April, Trump was discussing trade with French President Emmanuel Macron. At one point, he asked Macron, "Why don't you leave the EU?" and said that if France exited the Union, Trump would offer it a bilateral trade deal with better terms than the EU as a whole, better terms than the EU as a whole gets from the United States. Malcolm Nance and Jason Johnson join us next to discuss the impact of all this news on U.S. foreign relations and Vladimir Putin's effort to destroy Western democracies.
I've said it from day one, getting along with Russia and with China and with everybody is a very good thing. It's good for the world, it's good for us, it's good for everybody.
All right, joining us now is Malcolm Nance, MSNBC counterterrorism and intelligence analyst and author of the new book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy. And Jason Johnson is also back with us. All right, gentlemen, I've created a dealer's choice. It's almost like a game show. You can choose leave the EU, France. NATO is bad. Putin didn't do anything on our elections, and Crimea. Your choice, Malcolm Nance.
Oh, I get to choose one?
You do. Well, yeah. Choose more than one.
Well, I could choose them all because there's a reason all of this is coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. And I wrote an entire chapter about it. You know, Donald Trump is a spy's dream. I mean, he is just the perfect malleable character. But Spy Master in Chief Vladimir Putin has clearly got something over on Donald Trump. And I'll say it right now. He is in debt to Moscow, and he is paying that debt off to Moscow. But in 2013, he had a meeting at the Nobu restaurant for 2 hours with the top 12 richest oligarchs of Russia. And when he walked out of there, he was spouting the Moscow's line. He is still spouting Moscow's line. So when he goes to the Swedes and say, oh, you're not a member of NATO, but you participate from time to time, and the United States should be like that too, he means it. The Russians have told him that. When he says, break up the European Union, Macron, let's do a private deal, he means that because the Russians have told him that it's good. The Russians are his base, and he will never betray his base. And he is more than willing to betray his oath of office. He's already done it several times.
Yeah, and betray Crimea and say they should be able to be in Russia. You're talking about debt, Jason. We now know that Paul Manafort, who was his campaign chairman, was in debt to the tune of $10 million, a loan from one of these Russian oligarchs named Oleg Deripaska. An affidavit unsealed Wednesday also disclosed Deripaska had financially backed Manafort's consulting work in Ukraine.
Yeah, this There's a lot of rubles there, kind of going back and forth. And this is a thing I think is also important. You also mentioned sort of this upcoming summit, right? And we've already discussed, and Malcolm, everybody knows this, that everyone is terrified of this summit from an American security standpoint because we can't trust anything that comes out of this man's mouth, right? We have no idea what kind of information that Donald Trump will say just bragging to Vladimir Putin. He may give him the knock list and tell him where all the spies are because he wants to prove how tough he is. The other thing is we have to remember, and this is why this is dangerous, the Russians have already gotten their return on the investment, right? At this point, a summit is really just an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to stunt and flex on the United States and say, look what I got, because there's not much that's actually going to get accomplished one way or another. So I think the country needs to be aware that when the president is setting up these meetings with Kim Jong-un and with Vladimir Putin, it's not to do anything other than assuage his own ego. He wants to create a new alliance of not just oligarchs, but dictators across the world that will make him feel better about himself.
And the technical term for that is the axis of autocrats.
Right.
Vladimir Putin is crafting autocracies all throughout Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. He's got the government of Austria, has signed agreements with United Russia. They are almost an alliance. The Czech Republic, Italy tried to do it in France, Poland. Look, this is not going to end well for us. Democracy is not in retreat. Democracy is under direct attack, and it comes partially from the White House itself. Donald Trump, it wants to be that other autocrat. He feels that being an oligarch and being a person who can rule without the constraints of rule of law that George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison put in place is far better. And there is a pool of money, clearly, that he admires amongst the Russian elite oligarchy that he just couldn't get with his own effort. And you know what? Like I said, he doesn't seem particularly interested in the national security of the United States.
So, Jason, here's the problem with that, is that the founding fathers that put together this country, imperfect though it is, did build in what they believed would be a check on a rogue Article 2 power. It's called the Article 1 power. It's Congress. But at the moment, it is completely supine.
Yes. Well, look, when every single other branch of government has abdicated their responsibility to actually do checks and balances, I've said this for a long time, looking at this president, his behaviors, activities, the Constitution was not written for just a debauched human being. They had a naive assumption that we would eventually, more or less, we might elect liars, we might elect dishonest people, we might elect rude people, but we would not elect someone who fundamentally doesn't love the United States of America. And that's what we have right now. And if Congress doesn't want to do anything to stop him, and if the Supreme Court says deuces, Kennedy decides he wants to leave and leave the country to a bunch of white nationalists who want to pass the Muslim ban every 15 minutes, there is nothing we can do except vote as much as we can this fall and make sure the margins aren't slim, because that's when other people will kind of come in and mess up the numbers.
Joe Scarborough said in an op-ed last year, which I thought was brilliant, where he said the founding fathers did believe that at some point a populace put into power by the mob would come in there and start ruling like a tyrant. But he never thought that the Article 1 powers, that Congress would surrender themselves to be a Politburo, like the communists, right? A rubber stamp policy organization who will just, do slave as devotion like Saddam Hussein's crews, right? And just let him do whatever he wants to the Constitution of the United States.
Well, the people who have not surrendered to this, though, Jason, are the Europeans. It's been made very clear to Donald Trump, I believe, or at least to the press, right, that the European powers, the Western powers who remain, France, Germany, those who are still hanging on, are simply going to, sort of look away from us.
Right.
Do what they need to do together and try to hold the alliance. And in an economic sense, that actually could be harmful to the United States.
It's going to be incredibly harmful to the United States. We've seen it with these tariffs. We've seen it with these sanctions. Germany is still the economic engine of Europe. They don't want to talk to us anymore. Our largest trading partner is actually Canada. It's our largest unguarded border. It's a problem if we can't get along. The same thing happens with England. And mark my words, this Sunday, if Emmanuel López Obrador gets elected in Mexico, we're not going to have friends down there either. Okay, that's going to be a far-left president in Mexico who's going to be very, very aggressive about any of these sort of...
has to be aggressively against Trump, because remember, he has his own national interest to show he's strong as well.
And last point, the Russian strategy is very clear here. They've written about it. They've created doctrine about it. They are here to break the Atlantic Alliance. They use the phrase Atlanticist, like globalist, as an insult. The Washington, D.C. to the European capitals alliance that has existed since the end of World War II, that we lost millions of people to defend, they intend to break it, use Donald Trump to re-engineer it, and that Axis will go from Moscow to the European capitals to America as a subordinate organization.
I think at this point, having now talked about this with you guys for years, I understand that Donald Trump wants that. What I don't understand, Jason, I'm sorry, is why Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are okay with that.
Because they're not going to be affected. Because we talked about, they'll be foot soldiers in Gilead. They're fine, okay? They're perfectly fine with this new world that's going to be created. And I go so far, and I wrote about this last week, enough of the Democrats don't care because they don't fear what he's bringing because they don't think because Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi aren't terrified because they don't realize that a panel like this is the most dangerous thing to this administration. And they don't see that if they don't do something to fight, if they keep bringing butter knives to knife fights with this administration, we will all end up suffering down the road. No one will escape
When
this.
you're not at risk, it's easy to tell people to calm down. And that is, unfortunately, the truth. Jason Johnson, Malcolm Nance, I think we're all quite terrified right now. We appreciate talking to you guys. Thank you very much. Tonight's Last Word is next.
I think what we ought to do is stop focusing on 2020. I don't think 2020 matters today. There's one thing that matters today: winning control of the United States Congress, 2018.
Can you think of a reason why Joe Biden shouldn't run?
No, I love Joe. I mean, any number of people should run. But folks, come back. Please, Andrea. Not 2020, 2018. That's the focus.
That was former Secretary of State John Kerry speaking to Andrea Mitchell today, begging Democrats, begging them to get out and vote in November. The Supreme Court is going to be part of that fight. So it is time for tonight's Last Word about Justice Anthony Kennedy.
He's 81 years old, so he's going to go from sitting around in a robe all day to sitting around in a robe all day.
I never thought I'd say this, but you're only 81. You know, they say 81 is the new 79. And don't tell me your mind's going, because I read Bush v. Gore and Citizens United. You never had one.
Ouch. That's tonight's Last Word. I'm Joy Reid in for Lawrence O'Donnell.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.